be shown. Please put a nickname or turn off your cameras because we're going to be putting this on YouTube. Can everyone please turn off their mics? So yeah, just thank you so much. We are so grateful on behalf of the Decolonizing team for all the turnout, for all the participation. We've had wonderful sessions so far, and I hope that you guys will follow us on social media, from Twitter to Instagram, and see any other events that we might be taking and we might be having over the summertime. So yeah, thank you so much again. We'll be leaving links in the bio for mental health resources, especially with everything going on with the Black Lives Matter movement and the social injustices. We know that that has brought up a lot of trauma for a lot of students and a lot of Black practitioners. So if you want some mental health resources, those links will be in the chat. So yeah, thank you so much once again for joining, and I'm going to pass over to Emanuelle and she can start her presentation.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to start by thanking, of course, the team of students organizing this fabulous initiative. Thank you so much. I have been following some of the conferences online, some of the conferences through the YouTube recordings, because I do have a newborn in the house. She's 7 weeks old, and I hope she doesn't make an appearance through crying, but if she makes them, I apologize for that. There's someone to look at. My husband is there to look up after her, but you know, there might be some noise involved. I'd also like to specifically thank Ronke for her invitation for me to join this. The conversations about decolonizing the curriculum, the student-led conversations about decolonizing curriculum at Birmingham are happening at least over the last 3 years since I've joined. I've joined Birmingham in 2017. They have been happening, they have been student-led. The torch has been passed on from students who have graduated to students who are currently with us, and we can really see that it is getting the conversation at the university with students, with other academics, and I'm very happy for that. I'll start by sharing my screen. So I have a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation, but it's just to give you a bit of some visual cues about the stuff they're going to be talking about. So let me do this. I have this, and then I'm going to go for share screen. Fantastic. So, before I go into the whole topic of today and what I've prepared to share with you today, I'd like to start, of course, by evoking the decolonial trope of positionality. So everyone really does speak from a place, and my place of enunciation is a place as a Black woman at the University of Birmingham, but also as a Brazilian person, as a foreign Black person in the United Kingdom and working at the University of Birmingham. Also, I speak as a researcher, right? So my research is at the intersection of post-colonial studies, comparative literature, African studies, and modern languages. My main research focus has been over the past 5 years or 10 years on how peoples from the Portuguese-speaking Africa actually have been living in the way that, if taken into consideration by Western thinkings and by what the canon of post-colonial studies is, if they take that experience into consideration, they can really reshift their basis on the understanding of the whole idea of post-coloniality. So, and this is basically what my research is. So it brings on elements from an African perspective into the how can I call it, the wider epistemological ground of post-colonial studies, which is Western dominated in many ways. But I'm also speaking mainly when it comes to the decolonizing initiative. I'm speaking from the position of a teacher. So at the University of Birmingham since 2017, I am the academic lead of the Portuguese Studies program, undergraduate program. And on that role, I have had the fantastic opportunity to actually help shape all the modules really in terms of Portuguese language and cultures that are expressed in Portuguese, which is different than focusing on Portugal. So our curriculum is very broad in what it entails, but of course it is a practice that has really brought me the responsibility of trying to do the best that I can with the resources that I have and try to get better resources. So when I speak to you about decolonizing and going beyond the idea of buzzword and towards actual change, is basically, you know, it comes from this personal struggle really to actually try to make something transformative out of it, and to escape certain tropes and certain forms in which the very idea of decolonization is appropriated and has been co-opted by mainstream discourses. And over the course of the last 3 years, I've become very passionate about this. I've started some discussions at the Modern Languages department at Birmingham with colleagues about decolonizing. So we have been talking about it for at least 3 years. We have had meetings about this, meetings that are spontaneous, that people attend out of their free will, that really look into that engagement. And a lot of this stuff that we've been cooking in these meetings have now become part of a new master's program that we're launching this academic year, which is an MA course in comparative literatures and critical theories that has a massive decolonial component to it in terms of linguistic as well, because of course it is a comparative literature program within a department of modern languages. So the diversity of languages, the diversity of possibilities, the diversity of ways in which knowledge is produced and knowledge is conceptualized as part of it. And some of my interest has also materialized in terms of the Decolonising the Curriculum conference that had been organized to happen in March this year, but of course due to the current pandemic and the health crisis has been postponed. We're now thinking about taking it to the online platform in the autumn. We're thinking of September, but we still have to discuss this, to have to talk to our contributors in that sense. So we're going to be in touch with them. I'm going to let you know about this. So this is a bit of background. Where do I come from? What do I think I'm doing with this? And also when it comes to this presentation, I am not really going to tell, you know, I am not coming with any decisive, this is what decolonizing is, or this is what decolonizing should be. But what I have here is a number of reflections based on current affairs and the use of decolonizing. And this is basically part of my, how can I call it? Struggle with it and thinking it through. And I really would like to invite, as Ronke said in the beginning, your views on that. You know, what do you think about this, and how does that resonate with you? What are the ways which we think you're going? Do you recognize some of these issues that I'm identifying? You don't. So if we can have that conversation open, that's my main objective with this. Okay, so there we go. So in this talk today, just the topics that we're going to be covering. So I'm going to be talking about games, right? So the idea of decolonizing and the movements, decolonizing the curriculum, the movement's current momentum in the wake of the Black Lives Matter, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter UK protests, some caveats. So are we really decolonizing? Then of course we're going to look into the concept, we're going to revisit the concept, and I'm going to discuss a few ways forward that I see, okay? Which is basically trying to balance between going to a specific and not forgetting the systemic as we talk about what the decolonizing entails. So games, right? The decolonizing momentum, and this is of course a fantastic image that's being posted by the New York Times, and this is the moment that Colston is ditched into the Bristol Harbor. Now, one thing that I really love about this, and I would like to call the attention of the world to, is that it is in the context of the activism of the Black Lives Matter movement that has been sparked by the assassination of George Floyd in the United States by police brutality that we have here in the UK this demonstration. And the demonstrators make that connection, right, between nowadays racism and this legacy of colonialism, and the throwing away of that figure in the United Kingdom, even thinking about the whole idea, the whole colonial situation, and the impact of colonialism, of course, in promoting and getting racism into the institutions of today, is a link that is there, is a link that is tangible. I think nothing can be more tangible than this link, right? We are protesting against the assassination of Black people in the United States, and not only in the United States. We are protesting against the fact that Black lives don't matter as much to the white institutions, and the symbol that gets ditched is of a slave trader. And I would like then to call more of the attention to the implication of the trader part of the colonizer here and of colonization. But this is a fantastic moment. And it is a fantastic moment, of course, that has given new spirit to the Rhodes Must Fall initiative, right? So this is a bit of it's a very interesting, when I was looking at The Guardian about the kind of ways in which the media is speaking about the Rhodes Must Fall initiative, you have a little bit of a narrative, right? So in 2015, they go on saying, Oxford students step up campaign to remove Cecil Rhodes statue. Then in 2016, we have Cecil Rhodes statue to remain in Oxford after overwhelming support. And this is 2016, a year later, right? Now, in the beginning of the month, then we have the focusing of the media attention to the campaign. So, Fall of Bristol Colston statue revives Rhodes campaign in Oxford. And then, of course, this from 8th of June and then 12th of June, we have Oxford College officials back plans to protect Rhodes Memorial. So they're not moving. Then finally, in the 17th of June, 5 days later, Oxford College backs the removal of Cecil Rhodes statue. And the day after, the 18th of June, campaign doesn't end with Rhodes statue, says Oxford group. So this is a really interesting, this is a fantastic moment. We can really see how activism and how that understanding of that colonial moment has re-sparked existing conversations that were not being given much attention to. So, I mean, the way that The Guardian indexes their news shows that they really didn't care much about the issue between 2016 and 2020, or they just didn't organize it that way. But this is basically how the issue is presented on their website. It's important that it not only brought you know, the spotlight back to the Rhodes Must Fall, but it helped it to go places that it couldn't go 4 years ago, that it didn't have the backing to go 4 years ago. This is fabulous. And we have more conversations beyond academia, right? So we have the conversation in which labor councils have launched this labor statute review as another one was removed in London. So, you know, so labor councils all committing to look into the type of iconography that they have in the places they represent, and what is being celebrated or not, which is of course a very, very, very welcome initiative in that sense. And we have the Solidarity one, right? So Yorkshire Tea and PG Tips join brands in backing the Black Lives Matter movement, which I found absolutely important given the real tangible, you know, relationship between tea and the habit of tea in the United Kingdom and colonialism, right? So we have this, how can I call it? This widening of the conversation and people trying to do something about this. And again, we see a certain overlap between a discussion of wider racism against Black people that's been sparked by Black Lives Matter movement long ago, and that has now been reached a certain peak with the assassination of George Floyd. And of course, the reverberations of that and the investigation, so to speak, or a renewed interest in seeing that in the context of colonialism. However, you know, and then I talk about caveats. So are we really decolonizing? So we're going to be a bit more on Rhodes Must Fall. So of course, we have the idea that Oxford College backs the removal of Cecil Rhodes statue. That's the headline. But what are they really committed to, right? So in the Guardian article, it says, Oriel College voted on Wednesday to launch an independent commission of inquiry into the key issues surrounding the Rhodes statue. A spokesperson said in a statement that they had expressed their wish to remove the statue of Cecil Rhodes. This is what they intend to convey to the independent commission. right? And the Commission will deal with the issues of Rhodes' legacy and how to improve access and attendance of BAME, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic undergraduate, graduate students and faculty, together with a review of how the college's 21st century commitment to diversity can sit more easily with its past. So I'd like to call the attention here. So instead of committing to do it, they express their wish to remove the statue, right? And they're going to be looking into this. And they say they're going to do that in light of their 21st century commitment to diversity. And those are important terminology. They're not chosen at random. They express specific actions to be taken and specific extents into which the institution is willing to go, which I would argue, and as we're going to say later on, the very RHODESMUSTFALL movement will argue, is not enough. So the very idea that Oxford College backs removal of accessory Rhodes status, I would say, is pretty much exaggerated. They're saying they're going to look into it. They have instituted a commission to do that in a long period of time. They're not going to do that tomorrow, as if 4 years plus of discussions haven't been enough, right? So is that really, again, how do we understand that game? Should we remove this issue of our collective consciousness with the check that has been dealt with? And this is an interesting point here. So more on RHODESMUSTFALL, of course, this is the document that has been written by the movement on the 17th of June, and have been shared by them on their Twitter account. And they basically say that while the governing body of Oriel College have expressed their wish to take down the statue, we continue to demand their commitment to it, right? It is and it's really interesting, the kind of extent in which you put these very soft words there in order to point towards a direction doesn't really mean that you're going there. And then in the document, the movement continues saying that the letter from the Black and Minority Ethnic Staff Network, which invites the Vice Chancellor to make firm commitments in the direction of a decolonial, not diversified curriculum, and the gross issues of underrepresentation, touches on a matter which is central to the true decolonising at Oxford. In the spirit, we reaffirm, our commitment to. So it's really important that the movement is here recentering, saying we're not going to fall into this halfway, tokenistic ways of settling the matter. It's not a matter of that. We look for a more profound change. To have a decolonial, to go to a decolonial direction is different than going to the direction of diversification, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. So in this spirit, the movement reaffirms their commitment not only to the removal of the imperial and colonial iconography, such as the statues of Christopher Codrington and also scholars, but also the racial transformation of the academy through actions including, but not limited to, doubling the representation of Black staff and Black British students, as well as more Black African Rhodes scholars, and providing properly for their welfare and inclusions, and most crucially, decolonising the curriculum. Okay, so it's really interesting to say that this perceived gain is not yet seen as a complete gain by the very movement itself, because they're well aware of how the decolonisation proposal gets co-opted into the tropes of diversification and of inclusion, so to speak. So the same way we can talk about the discussions on iconography and tea that are happening in the public domain. This, of course, they get way more diluted, and gets way more diluted in ways that I would argue way more problematic. So when it comes to the decision by Labour, we have Sadiq Khan saying, and this is an extract by Sadiq Khan in the piece by the article. Sadiq Khan says, "It is an uncomfortable truth that our nation and city owes a large part of its wealth to its role in the slave trade, and while this is reflected in our public realm, on the contribution of many of our communities to the life of our capital has been willfully ignored. This cannot continue. The Black Lives Matter protests have rightly brought this to the public attention, but it's important that we take the right steps to work together to bring change and to ensure that we can all be proud of our public landscape. So the discussion here then becomes a matter of public landscaping of iconography of those people who have made the country or not, rather than actually the proper issue. And again, the issue of colonization gets pigeonholed only into those figures that have had an active role in the slave trade. Now, we know very well that colonialism in itself is an economical practice, is part of capitalism. So it is, of course, crucial to understand and to remember and to look and to point and to pinpoint how those who benefited from the slave trade, of the trade of enslaved people, are still in positions of political and economic power in the United Kingdom and beyond, of course. Brazil is not by any means an exception to that rule. But it's important to look at that in the wider respect that colonialism had. And of course, the solidarity then becomes a joke, because tea is one of those legacies and one of those producers that we still consume. It's one of those products that's still massively grown in India today, right? So when it comes to the solidarity, we have, of course, Yorkshire Tea, which is owned by Harrogate-based Betty's and Taylor's Group, replied, "Please don't buy our tea again. We're taking some time to educate ourselves and plan properly before we post. We stand against racism," which is interesting, right? And PGT goes on and tweets, if you, to some Twitter user who is boycotting tea brands who are supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. So they say to this person, if you are boycotting teas that stand against racism, you are going to have to find 2 new brands of tea now. PG Chips, it's owned by the consumer goods conglomerate Unilever, and which also makes Marmite and pot noodles, among many other products. And of course, the 2 companies used to grow tea in Assam in India, both have pointed to steps they have taken to improve the conditions of the workers there and have published a list of their suppliers. However, Tradecraft report publishes in January accuses them of a number of the UK tea brands of knowing about the conditions of women working in tea estates, but not doing enough about them. The report urged great transparency about production process. So you have a dissociation here between the exclusion of humans, the racism that has been conceptualized within colonialism, has been institutionalized between colonialism, and has been taken forward to today, and actual productive practices that will prey on similar forms of human exclusion that happen today in the laundry of capitalism. So going forward, as we are already late, so revisiting the concept. So one of the things that I'll always call the attention to is that decolonizing itself is a term which has many meanings, and these meanings are not settled. These meanings are contested by many people. It is a site of very topical definitions, and I really say that many people, when they use decolonizing, just tell us what you mean by it, because it's. And again, if we go into a politics of positionality, who are you? How are you using this? How is this being useful for the reflection you're breaking? How is this being useful for the activities you're breaking? How is this being useful to the transformation you're proposing? So amongst the many meanings, I have isolated a couple of ways in which decolonize can mean, and it can refer to, of course, the European withdrawal or expelling from overseas colonies. I specifically, myself, I have a bit of a niche talking about the decolonization as, as this action that European powers do. They colonize and they decolonize as a verb, that is this verb that demands an agent, and the agent of decolonization is still the colonizer. Whether when it comes to Portuguese-speaking Africa, for example, that's absolutely not the case. It's been 13 years plus of wars that actually made the history to put down there that the colonizers have been driven away from the African territories that the Portuguese had. The Africans have driven them away. They managed to expel them. They managed to win their independence rather than they were given it. right? But decolonizing can also mean the effort by former European colonies to reconceptualize local culture, political institutions, and economy in the aftermath of colonialism. So this is pretty much in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's frame of view of decolonizing the mind. So, or RHODESMUSTFALL discussion in South Africa. So basically, former colonies in which people are looking into and are themselves taking the lead and reconceptualizing what their culture, how their ways of living in the world should be. They are decolonizing themselves in the sense. They are choosing what stays in terms of colonial heritage. They are choosing what goes away. So there is this discussion from this concept as well, this context. And of course, we can also see the idea of decolonizing as a way to implement the decolonial agenda, which is aligned with the radical intellectual project of decolonial thinking, which is also a project grounded on the experience. If you talk about Walter Miolo, for example, and if you're talking about Maria Lugones, and if you talk about Ramon Buruz-Fogo, they are people who are thinking about these issues from a perspective that is informed by the Latin American, not exclusively, but it's formed by the Latin American experience of colonialism. So it's also another way of looking into that has a different epistemological tradition, so to speak, and that's also rich. And of course, decolonizing can also refer to a theory and a practices or a praxis in the global north that analyzes and denounces and seeks to dismantle the colonial legacies in present-day institutions. So I basically say that when we talk about decolonizing, the context of decolonizing the curriculum in the global north, we're talking about its own thing. We're talking about a global north-based discussion that has to do with how people of color within those societies see themselves represented in their institutions and how they see the world at large being part of these institutions. And it is a different discussion, I would say. And one of the things that I usually keep asking people to do is, how do you mean decolonizing? To what extent do you mean decolonizing? Because of course, decolonizing demands an understanding and a certain view on colonialism, right? So as we can see here, in every definition of this only four that are isolated, we have the intrinsic connection with colonialism, decolonizing colonialism, which is in the name itself. And in most definitions that I've listed, the focus is on the realm of culture. And all the definitions rely on a good grasp of the meaning of colonialism, which first and foremost is an economical enterprise. Now, this talks back to something that I noticed. There is a tendency, I think, in cultural studies and in studies of culture at large, which is to, of course, when we're talking about literary studies, we're talking about the aesthetic element and how literature works and how the word means. And, you know, we're analyzing that, but we can't decouple the cultural artifacts from its material context of production. So colonialism is a form an economic system, first and foremost, and it is an economic system that has completely reorganized societies and has completely generated cultures of exclusions that will get people to feel diminished, that will get people in that subaltern position. But it is a system that does so in order to perpetrate a certain form of economic exploitation that will evolve into the type of capitalism that we have internationally today. And that is an evolution. There is a continuation. There is not a break. And I think that that continuation is one of the things that we have to focus on. And again, I think this is when we go on and how we view colonialism, we have references to colonialism in the Western collective consciousness today that tend to focus on the human suffering and on the physical and emotional cultural levels, which is, of course, there, and it is real, and it's being perpetrated today, right? So, it's usually images of people who have been shown in all sorts of situations of pain, of suffering, whose bodies, and we have this whole conversation on whose body, whose delacerated body is one to be shown, and which delacerated body is the one to be concealed, right? People of color, enslaved, photographies of enslaved people, photographies of migrants today, right, who died crossing the Mediterranean. Their images, their suffering, right, their pain is portrayed wide, their pictures are all shown, while, even the reference to people who take their own lives in the UK today is made in a way that's not very open. So you have this, some bodies are the ones that, you know, whose suffering can be shown in a more open way, in a less sensitive way. Other bodies will have that dignity protected. So why that protection doesn't go everywhere. So of course, this is a real thing. There's also another picture that I like to show, which is enslaved people working the plantation. So this is in Sao Paulo in the coffee harvests, right? So, and these are enslaved people actually working, right? And this is the element that I like to call attention. I like to call attention to the element of the plantation, the element of the coffee, the element of that coffee that we still drink today. So the permanence is not only of that suffering, the permanence is for the very reason for that suffering to come forward, and it's still there. I mean, Channel 4 has done a massive inquiry about how Nespresso or how Nestle actually harvests, how they grow the coffee beans that fuel our sweet Nespresso pods. And we have seen that the kind of conditions of labor that people have, they are not so very separate from what had been happening during colonialism and slavery. And again, I think that the problem with decolonizing here and the ways in which it can be co-opted is by decoupling colonialism and racism from capitalism. So the disconnection between the human and the material aspects of colonialism, which render its cultural analysis, in my view, incomplete. So we have, you know, photographs like this of conservative MPs standing in front of the statue of Churchill that said that had been, in their views, vandalized, saying that Churchill was racist. But of course, before that, you have a black man working in that position of cleaning the statue, right? A black man who is not to be seen amongst the type of politicians that demand that thing to happen. And this is also the kind of thing that makes us very moved when we see the amount of BAME workers of the NHS that have been taken down, have been killed by COVID-19, the overwhelming number of BAME people that is there. And we forget that, you know, if you work at the NHS and if you are a person of a non-white origin, if you were an immigrant or if you were a descendant of immigrant families, you are more likely to be working the, say, more manual jobs and less likely to be sitting in high commissions and then have your time protected to actually be facing patients. So this is not only an issue of what do we do or what we do not do with BAME staff. It's basically there is the lowest paid or the more manual labor, that we have at the NHS is made by non-white people. And while the more political roles in the NHS is disproportionately made by white British people. So these are the connections that I would like to be making, and these are the connections that I think they lack for a view of decolonizing that is truly transformative. So major issues in the use of the concept then is the disconnection between the topical and the systemic, right? So the ideas here is what I would say they tend to privilege ideas of inclusion, representation, iconography, and conceals the embodiment of neoliberal values underlying the progressive agenda that they tend to put forward. So inclusion by adding more racially diverse individuals, what does that mean, right, to institutions, but not adding their views, not adding the different ways of viewing the institutions, right? And as does going into this idea of representation, that having people, a number of people of color into certain institutions is enough to get these institutions to think wider. While it's the type of representation that we have can be very problematic, as we see by the current Tory cabinet that we have at the point. You know, Priti Patel is not really the embodiment of progressive politics and rethinking of colonial past, for example, and she is a woman of color who is sitting in the Home Office today. So there is a tendency in the kind of how can I call it, co-opted views of decolonizing the curriculum to avoid engaging with different ways to conceptualize the institutions and the activities in question. There's no way we're going to decolonize in the curriculum if we don't discuss methodology, what research is, what knowledge is. Can we really do that without discussing these things, right? And the problematic conceptualizing, the buzzwordy way of decolonizing the career, of doing the decolonizing, tends to avoid acknowledging the racial groups are culturally heterogeneous and ideologically diverse, right? They tend to avoid changing the colonial inherited patterns of distribution of wealth and political power. Can we really decolonize if we don't really redistribute wealth? If we keep the wealth in the hands of those who have made it on the back of colonialism, and not only in terms of not pigeonholing here only those involved in the slave trade, but those involved in the entirety of the change of the system, right? And they avoid recognizing that systemic change needs a change in cultural values, and avoid connecting the colonialism of yesterday with capitalism of today. There is no clear cut between the two. So this is, in terms of ways forward in decolonizing, what I would say is we have to, just like the colleagues in the RHODESMUSTFALL movement have emphasized, I think we have to emphasize going towards the systemic, right? So what should we consider to decolonize the curriculum and beyond that? I believe that the current ways in which knowledge is produced, validated, and disseminated, that was established in the age of colonization, we have to consider to change that. We have to embody other ways of conceptualizing it. So knowledge, how we conceptualize knowledge. Can we really talk about decolonizing without talking about what knowledge is? We should consider that colonialism hasn't only created harmful hierarchies of race, it has contributed to conceptualize just about every aspect of people and society that has a bearing on definitions of gender, sexuality, ability, faith, political organizations, etc. So when we talk about, colonialism, when we talk about slave trade, and we talk about race, we forget that heterosexuality has been imposed in many places, heteronormativity has been imposed, the ideas of what a man is, of what a woman is, and how they function within colonial societies, and how they function to aid that economic exploitation. And I think we should consider, each one of us should consider that we speak from a place of enunciation and within a given context. So to think of pathways to decolonize, one should be honest about its own limits, and those limits to their own project of decolonization. And putting up the limitations there are fabulous, because you basically clearly indicating to a wider community of people engaged in these activities, saying, look, this is how much I can do, and this is the extent of what I can do will go. And that will allow someone else to pick up from where you left off and to take the action further. In this way, we can have a number of localized specific actions building up to systemic proper change. Right? And finally, to decolonize as a Western subject, it is to learn to unlearn. Because if we are in the global north, if we are children of the Western academia, what are we talking about when we're talking about decolonizing it? How can we systemically change something that has basically educated us? So we have to look at ourselves in the mirror, and we have to ask ourselves, what don't I know? Is it like this everywhere? Has it always been like this everywhere? And how small is what I conceive as everywhere? And basically look for other people from other places that are conceptualizing knowledge institutions and life in a different way. Okay, so this is basically where I would like to go. I'm very sorry I've been way too long, and that's about it from me. I hope to have a bit of time to hear from you as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was really insightful. I especially love the part of conceptualizing knowledge. Is it okay if we all mute our mics, please? Just so that we can all move forward. So if everyone can please mute their mics. Thank you. So yeah, thank you so much for that. That was really insightful. And I think it's a great way to end this. You can see by the influx of people saying thank you that everyone pretty much enjoyed it. So for the next, we're going into the discussion time now, so can people type in their questions if they have any, so that we can answer them. And then if you do want to speak and share your knowledge, please keep it as brief as possible, and please put your hands up and wave if you do so. But yeah, we're just gonna wait for questions. But while we wait for people to type in their questions, if they have any, I was gonna say, if you guys have any, if anyone here has any suggestions, this is the last session of the conference, but if anyone has any suggestions for the team or have any ideas or any feedback, please email us. John will put our email in the link, and please email us and or tweet us or yeah, email us, tweet us, follow us on Instagram, and leave your suggestions. We're looking to continue these kind of conferences, possibly, if we can, over the summer. So yeah, thank you so much for joining once again, and especially for the people who've been here from the very beginning, from the very first session. So I'm just gonna look for questions now and ask them. And please make sure, if you want to talk, because we do want to make this an interactive session, please wave at us or put your hands up, the hands up function. Yes, so I'm just gonna look. Someone asks, I think it's the first question, can we have a decolonized university until the sort of inequality that we see in today's academia continue? The lack of funding for international PhD student, rapid casualization, etc. have made the UK academia difficult to access for anyone but upper middle class, mostly British people. So can we have a decolonized university until the sort of inequality that we see in today's academia continues?
Yeah, I think no, really. And I think that's one of the things with decolonizing, and I find it interesting that the verb is in the gerund here, right? Nobody talks about decolonized curriculum, decolonized academia. So the idea that I understand that the movement has is the attempt of actually tackling these issues, the attempt. But, and this is something very interesting that Professor Kahinda Andrews brought in his intervention in this conference. He said that, you know, as a Black professor of a British university, if he would go something along those lines, down into the last consequences of what he was saying, he would end the British university, you know, because it is a contradiction in terms in that sense. If we understand that universities, mainly in the UK, are part of a culture that in general has profited from the exploitations of other people, these are at the basis not only of the bricks that constitute our institutions, but also the way things are conceptualized. So I think that part of the effort of decolonizing the curriculum and the academia is basically recognizing that the academia is not open for everybody, and it is open for those who have a track record of having indirectly benefited from it and has a track record of excluding those who don't. So I think that continue the conversation and pushing institutions to actually bring on, because with more people we have more perspectives. And this is an important thing. It's not only about bringing people of color for the sake of bringing people of color. It is bringing a diversity. It's a vast area of subjects and a vast area of ways into looking at the same kind of things that we're doing as well. So it's not only bringing the people, but bringing the perspectives in many ways, right? So I don't think that there can be a decolonized academia with these deep-seated issues. I think these deep-seated issues are part of the problem of the academia that goes way beyond the curriculum, and they're put together. And I think this is one of the things that we should be tackling, and we should be openly discussing with our institutions.
Yeah, thank you. I know you're not in STEM, but someone asks, how can we practically decolonize the curriculum in STEM, and how can we sell this to those in STEM?
This is really interesting. I was discussing with some colleagues at HAFI last year, before the pandemic, about having an actual thing at the University of Birmingham to include people in STEM. I think one of the very ways in which we can understand is basically understand the development of the construction of the idea of science and of scientific inquiry and putting it back into time, right? So if it has happened, as it has happened and consolidated at a certain time where colonialism was in vogue, so this is pretty much part of how the basis of this of the actual inquiry will happen. You know, who is the subject, who is the object, what is objectivity in STEM and what's subjectivity in STEM, what is, who gets to research, who gets to be researched, and of course, what are the concepts of good and bad or developed, underdeveloped. I think one of the ways in which we could actually get into STEM is to bring back the discussion on the objectivity and on the validity of methods and methodologies, and ask, are our methods really the best methods there are?
Yeah.
Why aren't other methods as good as? And I think, of course, thank you very much for recognizing I'm not from STEM, which I'm not. But I think that there are certain foundation epistemological basis in STEM subjects that could very well do with a conversation and could very well do with a reconceptualization in the 21st century that should be led on and should be done by the colleagues in STEM.
Yeah, completely. Thank you so much for that. Someone asked, I guess this is beyond the scope of the curriculum, but you can touch on it briefly. What is the link between Unilever and colonization? So you can touch on this really briefly, because
I do not know the history of Unilever. What I know is that companies that today profit of cheap labor of countries that were former colonies once.
Yeah.
We have to look at that in the long durée of colonialism into capitalism.
Yeah.
That it's not, you know, it's not by chance that many Western companies do take cheap labor in India. Right? It's not for any reason. It's not for any reason. Of course, you can say, oh, the weather there is better for tea. Well, yes, but you can still pay them properly to be having that tea made, and we all would have tea that is grown by people who have decent wages.
Yeah.
So I think this is a question, which is a really tricky question, because like, do you know your history? No, I don't know my history, because I need to know my present only. And by knowing my present, I can go there and take a look into my history. And I think those are questions we should ask. And we should see to which extent every company that conceives itself as a capitalist company, which are companies committed to the exponential improvement of an increasing of profit, we have to ask ourselves to which extent their search for profit actually will build on practices that were developed and perpetuated in colonialism and have gone through capitalism.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's brilliant. Thank you so much for that. For the person who asked the STEM question, somebody has put a link up to a useful podcast, so please check that out. John Andrew, someone asked, by withdrawing from Europe/EU and the overemphasizing links with Australia, is vote leave-led government effectively trying to recolonize rather than decolonize? Again, this is outside the scope of curriculum, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Could you repeat that, Ronki, please?
So someone asked, by withdrawing from Europe/the EU and by overemphasizing links with Australia, for instance, is the vote leave-led government effectively trying to recolonize rather than decolonize?
Yeah, well, the whole idea of vote leave campaign and belongings, the idea of Europe, the idea of what is, it's not Europe, the idea of the Commonwealth, the idea of Lusophonia, the idea of Francophony, all of those ideas, they are part of this conversation that includes colonialism. And of course, I'm not a specialist in that sense, but I would say that I do not know the terms of the alignment with Australia. Do you see what I mean? It is the terms of the alignment and of the relationship that will get us to see, is it a relationship of equality, but also what is Australia? How does Australia treat its First Nations, right? What is Australia, in the same way, what is Brazil, what we consider as Brazil today, because Brazil was a former colony, but Brazil is a former colony that has the internal colonialism to its indigenous people. So what are the kind of relationships that this government is putting together with Australia? What are the kind of relationships that this country has to Europe? And to which extent do we have to celebrate Fortress Europe that much? You know, we keep on saying, and again, I'm not doing the vote leave discourse. What I'm doing here is to basically saying, when we're looking into the world today with the views of recognizing the inequalities that are palpable today and inherit from a 500-year plus history of dispossession, we have to be willing to take that there are no just like, you know, innocent hands in it, and we have to recognize that there are problems in many of those places. So I do not know. I wouldn't say that Britain would be in a position, but from a very lay perspective, I wouldn't imagine that the terms the Britain is putting to Australia are about recolonization or colonization as such. But I certainly connect the idea of the discourse around vote leave that has happened. I was in this country when vote leave happened. They inherit from a deep-seated view of British exceptionalism that has British colonialism and British imperialism in their roots.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm gonna answer two more questions because of the time we have, and I'm sorry, ask two more questions, and then if anyone wants to speak, we can take one or two comments, and please keep it brief once again, and then we'll end the session. So the next question is something you've already touched on, but I guess you can touch on briefly again. Can we have decolonized university onto the sort of inequality that we see in lack of funding for international PhD students, rapid casualization in today's academia continue? So can we have it despite all these issues?
No, I think these issues are the issues that have to be addressed if we want to decolonize academia. If we want to this march towards an idea of because again, exploitation of people in precarious situations is basically what that is, right? And this is basically one of the premises of colonialism.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Someone said, my question is, do you think that the current mainstreaming of anti-racism and the decolonizing agenda is more of an opportunity or a threat to the decolonizing agenda in light of the issues that you discussed today?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and I think this is the never-ending question of capitalism co-opts everything, right? And we have to be aware of that, the fact that every movement of resistance within this economic system will be objectified, will be fetishized, will be emptied out. There will be, this is how the revolutions get cancelled. That's how, there is a movement, this is always going to happen. But I think that one thing that we have to do is basically to resist it. One of the things that I really loved about the Rhodes Must Fall document is that, an activity is that, even though people in the wider community, I think if I would ask people outside if they think that Oxford has committed to do it, they will say yes, Oxford has committed to do it. Well, Oxford has committed to look into it, and which is a very different thing, is the fact that the movement has brought it back and say, you're saying you're going to look into it, you're not committing to it. Mm. And it's to basically resist this movement of co-optation and exist this emptying out of the revolutionary potential of it all. So I think this is, co-optation is always going to be there. I don't think that invalidates any attempt. I think that activists, scholars, people that don't directly advocate for it but are aware of it, we should just know it happens, and should we do our work despite it, and we should do our work against it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Someone asked, I think it's one of your students, asked as an MFL student, which I don't really know what MFL stands for. You might. I think maybe modern foreign languages. And one of Emanuelle's students, I find it frustrating. It's hard for non-languages students to access modules/courses about different colonial and post-colonial experiences other than the British one. How can MFL work and other departments to broaden the studies of colonialism?
This is one of the things that I've been trying to raise in my department, right? Of course, colleagues have a vast array of research interest, and colonialism doesn't have to be everybody's research topic. Mm-hmm. It is the when we think of a curriculum as a large of a program of 4 years of undergraduate, or 3 years plus a year abroad, mm-hmm. We think of a curriculum that has space for a multitude of perspectives into society. So those are the conversations that we're having. I have had colleagues that do, 18th century German culture. I have colleagues that do the things that are not seen as related to colonialism, or who study more canonic poets that are seen outside of those questions. I think what we're trying to do in modern languages today is make sure that our curriculums include those systemic questions as well, and that those systemic questions change how we do that. But we have to see that, you know, the most of our lectures are over, you know, are 40 plus years old, and they have been formed by a different academia, the very idea of knowledge, the very stuff that we've read. So people are re-educating themselves, and that takes time, and that takes understanding it. And I think these discussions that we're having today are absolutely leading us up to this. When it comes to the Department of Modern Languages of Birmingham today, our equality and diversity lead is collating information exactly on that. She's asking everybody in the department, what are you doing in your modules to actually discuss these systemic issues? And people are collating this information together so we can actually now produce a more consistent response to that.
Yeah, perfect. I'm gonna ask one last question and then we can round up. So with colonization so built into the fabric of higher education, for example, in terms of procurement practices that rely on contracting with partners with unethical practices, what would be good practices to raise consciousness within organizations to push for change? How best to sell, in quote, the argument to people whose priorities are financial/cost saving?
Yeah, I have an approach as a researcher and as a person that is not very soft. I basically say what you're doing is you are exploiting these people. I think there are certain words that we should not be afraid of using. And I think there are certain words we should not be afraid of. We should not be afraid of calling out racism when it happens, when it's, which is different from calling a person racist, because, you know, you're not assessing a person's views and understanding of the world. You were talking about their actions. And I think we have to call the actions for what they are, right? Prey on the precarious working conditions of early career staff to basically staff courses by underpaying them, or prey into graduate students' precarious status to staff courses and not open full-time positions, is specifically taking advantage of underprivileged, and is specifically taking advantage of exploitation, is doing exploitation. And we should look at our institutions and call it for what it is. I think calling it for what it is the best thing that we can do, not allowing them to rob us from the language, to articulate the continuations that practices of today established with continuation from practices that were perpetrated in colonialism. We should call, it's really interesting, history, you know, people take a very exotic view in history. This ends, this begins, right? Well, there is no real clear cut, and the lack of that clear cut is where we have to inhabit. We have to inhabit, we have to remake those connections. And we have to challenge those who deny them to prove to us that it doesn't happen. Because it does. The very fact that postgraduate teaching assistants that they're not going to have their contracts renewed for next year due to COVID-19 don't have how to pay their rent by basically doing the only labor they know how to do, they've been trained to do, is a disgrace. And we have to call it for what it is. The survival of these people, the livelihoods of these people are being put in danger.
I completely understand. Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you so much, Emanuelle. I know I've learned a lot and I have a lot to think about. So thank you. I know your schedule is busy with the newborn. So thank you so much for coming and teaching us so many amazing things. Thank you everyone, especially if you've been here from the very beginning on the 4th of June till now, for joining the Decolonising the Curriculum talks and the conference as a whole. Thank you so much for supporting us. And if you want, you can again reach out to us about anything that you would like to. If in fact, if you have some feedback, if you have some questions, if you have some suggestions on how we can continue creating events like this, please reach out to us on our social media that is linked in the chat at Decolonise Birmingham, I believe. So thank you once again, everyone, for joining in. We really, really appreciate this. Thank you once again, Emanuelle, for giving us an amazing send-off. I really enjoyed this session once again. And yes, thank you, everyone. And I'm going to end the chat now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye.